Hello, everybody. My research explores gender as a moderator of the relationship between religiosity and well-being. Religiosity is known to be positively correlated with well-being. And this finding is going to be the focus of the exploration within our study. An important component of the relationship is related to gender. Specifically, women report greater religiosity levels than men. Why would this be? One possibility is that men and women answer the question, who do you believe God to be, in different ways. In other words, men and women may have different God images. Indeed, God images is one way to assess religiosity. God images refer to one's internal conceptualization of who God is. And they generally fall into two main categories. A benevolent God image usually consists of characteristics such as God is compassionate, forgiving, or kind, whereas authoritarian God images tend to perceive God as ruler, creator, or a punisher. Within the context of this current study, we used constructs of God images from two previous works. The first work, which really served as the model for our current analysis, is Nguyen and Zuckerman 2016, which used the following God images in blue: relational God, provider God, ruler God, and creator God. We also found another study conducted by Johnson, Cohen, and Okun 2016, who used only two God images: God is benevolent and God is authoritarian. As you can see from some of the quoted material below, there's a large chance that they can be correlated and interrelated, which is why the predictions that we used for Nguyen and Zuckerman, we also tested in parallel with those by Johnson, Cohen, and Okun in red. There are three main lines of prediction within the current study. First, we wanted to replicate that finding that women tend to associate more strongly with benevolent God images rather than with authoritarian God images. Additionally, we wanted at whether communal and agentic values mediate the moderating role of gender in the relationship between religiosity and well-being. Someone who's communal would tend to be described as very community-minded, who enjoys serving others, whereas people who are agentic tend to be very self-serving. It's been found that women tend to exhibit greater communal values than men. The second line of predictions is based on a finding across studies, cultures, and religions that women tend to exhibit greater religiosity than men. If it's true that men and women hold different God images, perhaps this could explain why there's an incredibly stark gender difference in religiosity. Along the line of prediction 3, we assessed whether God images may be correlated with different health outcomes. Specifically, we would expect, based on previous research, that a benevolent God image would be associated with lower levels of depression, whereas belief in an authoritarian God image would be associated with higher levels of depression, more severe depressive symptomatology, and that these relationships would be more true for females as opposed to male counterparts. Additionally, within the context of the current study, we assessed more measures beyond just depression. Looking at our methodology, we used Amazon Turk as a recruitment site and recruited 1,196 participants using the service. 166 were deleted for reasons such as failing attention checks, spending less than 3 minutes on the survey, leaving 61 or more blank responses, and answering only with endpoints. Those deletions resulted in a total used value of 1,030 participants. Importantly, all of the data collection occurred well before the coronavirus outbreak. Looking at demographics, our majority population was white, Christian, and slightly more male than female. and the average age was approximately 38 years old. Looking at how we analyzed our variables, we included a broader set of measures than just the Nguyen and Zuckerman 2016 article upon which this current research is based. We looked at several measures of well-being, from self-esteem to psychological well-being. We looked at physical health in terms of somatic health, and we looked at mental health problems ranging from depression to anger, social anxiety, and general anxiety as well. We also included measures of religiosity. It's important to note that we operationalized religiosity as how important religious values are to an individual, rather than looking at how frequently an individual attends an institutionalized service, such as Mass or synagogue. We also used God image constructs from both the Nguyen and Zuckerman and Johnson and colleague analyses. We also measured agentic and communal values. All of our scales were self-report based and were measured using Likert scales. Looking at our results, we first consider the Nguyen and Zuckerman God image findings. And we find probably the most interesting result of our analysis here. We found that the creator God image was more highly correlated with the relational and provider God constructs than with the ruler God, which is extremely contrary to what we would expect. We expected that the relational and provider God images would correlate highly together, and the ruler and creator God images would correlate highly together. Because this is not the case, it's clear that participants didn't reliably distinguish among the God images as we would have expected, and also implies that participants may see the creator God image as resembling something closer to the relational and provider God constructs. This could have potential important implications for future investigations. While our hypotheses for the Nguyen and Zuckerman God images didn't pan out as we would expect, and thus our predictions along that line of research are null, we did have some more favorable findings with the Johnson and colleagues' authoritarian and benevolent God images, as they did reveal some predicted gender differences. Specifically, males tended to associate more strongly with the authoritarian God image as opposed to the benevolent God image, and agentic values tended to positively correlate and positively predict authoritarian values, while communal values tended to negatively predict authoritarian beliefs, which was exactly what we would have expected. So taken together, the Johnson and colleagues' authoritarian and benevolent God images, along with the Nguyen and Zuckerman ones, generally our predictions didn't pan out as we would have hoped. So to increase power, we developed a relative benevolence score, which was created by subtracting authoritarian beliefs from the extent to which an individual believes in a benevolent God. In other words, the greater the relative difference between an individual's endorsement of benevolent and authoritarian scores tended to correlate with a higher relative benevolence score. From now on, the rest of the presentation results will be focused on these post hoc explorations. First, we assessed the relationship between gender and relative benevolence, looking at whether gender predicts relative benevolence and possible mediating role of agentic and communal values. We indeed found that females tended to exhibit greater scores of relative benevolence, and that agentic and communal values mediated that relationship. Females, as opposed to males, tended to exhibit greater belief in communal values, which in turn positively related to relative benevolence. Whereas males, as opposed to females, tended to exhibit greater belief in agentic values, which negatively predicted relative benevolence. Perhaps the most intriguing finding of this research is that, contrary to what we would expect, females and males did not significantly differ in reported religiosity, which rendered any mediation testing impossible. However, we instead decided to focus our attention on the relationship between relative benevolence and religiosity, considering whether gender might moderate that relationship. And in fact, we found that it did. The relationship between relative benevolence and religiosity was shown to be stronger and more predictive for females rather than males, specifically at levels of low relative benevolence. To explain the graph a little bit, at levels of high relative benevolence comparing males and females did not significantly differ in religiosity at levels of high relative benevolence. However, at levels of low relative benevolence, males and females did exhibit significant differences in religiosity. Specifically, males far exceeded females in their reported religiosity. Finally, the third focus point of our results used a factor analysis using the 8 well-being measures that we looked at in this study to produce 3 main factors. The first factor was mental health problems. Factor 2, we operationalized as subjective well-being. And factor 3, physical health, placed on its own. We were interested in the relationship between relative benevolence as a predictor of well-being and wondered if it was more predictive of well-being for males as opposed to females or vice versa. We found that, unfortunately, for our results, there was no interaction, meaning that relative benevolence didn't predict well-being more strongly for females or males. However, we did find by testing relative benevolence on its own, it did correlate with lower mental health challenges, greater subjective well-being, and had no significant relationship to physical health. So to summarize these findings of this presentation, we analyzed 4 gut images from the Nguyen and Zuckerman investigation that did not support predictions, mainly because we found that the creator God ruler was quite aberrant from what we would have expected, and participants didn't reliably distinguish among the God images. However, we did find some interesting findings regarding relative benevolence. Females scored much higher on the relative benevolence measure than males, and this gender difference was partially mediated by belief in communal and agentic values. Additionally, there was the relationship between relative benevolence as a predictor of religiosity was more true and more strong for females as opposed to males. Finally, we also found that relative benevolence was correlated with higher mental well-being, lower levels of mental health problems, but was not moderated by gender. There are several limitations that should be acknowledged. Firstly, the majority of results that are featured in this presentation are post hoc. We used only self-report data, so we didn't use any triangulating information, especially related to individuals' reported mental health and mental well-being. Additionally, as is common with MTurk, we had a less diverse population than we would have hoped. Future directions include replicating the findings of this study and also further testing relative benevolence, as it was a construct created uniquely for the purposes of this study. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Chen Li and Annetta Snell for assisting with this study, to Marone for his incredibly supportive mentorship, to Dr. Davies for serving as a second reader of my thesis, and to Dr. Dodel-Fader and Dr. Ellenboss for their feedback in creating this presentation. Finally, the full citations are listed here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.